Hello, and welcome to the Washington Courts Report, the official podcast of the Administrative Office of the Courts. I'm your host, Patric Haerle, and for today's episode, we'll be diving into the juvenile justice system, discussing the association that guides all juvenile court administrators in Washington, and learning more about the programs and processes of the juvenile justice system. So to discuss this, I'm excited to be joined by Chris Simonsmeier, the Clark County Juvenile Court Administrator and current president of the Washington Association of Juvenile Court Administrators, and Jack Murphy, Douglas County Juvenile Court Administrator and the incoming president of the WAJCA. Jack, Chris, thank you for joining me today.
Hello. Thanks, Patrick.
Thanks, Patrick, for having us.
Yeah, so just to get started, I want to give our audience a little overview of WAJCA, what some of its functions are, and maybe what you two do a little bit as president. So, Jack, starting with you, could you give us an overview of WAJCA and some of the projects the association is currently working on?
Sure, thanks for that. You already spoke about it, but WAJCA stands for, it's a tough acronym, but it stands for Washington Association of Juvenile Court Administrators. We're over 50 years old. We were created in 1972. All 34 juvenile courts are members of WAJCA. That includes 39 courts. There's 34 jurisdictions. The juvenile courts are a subdivision of Superior Court in each county. Our mission is steadfast commitment to youth and families, transforming obstacles into opportunities. Our vision statement is creating safe and healthy communities. Some of our strategic goals are to exemplify leadership in youth justice by advocating for legislation, policy, and practices that benefit youth, families, and healthy, safe communities. We also advocate for a diverse, equitable, and inclusive juvenile justice system. We promote innovation in youth justice. We're also a learning organization. We facilitate development within our members to adapt, transform, and succeed in a rapidly changing environment by using best practices that we all agree on. We also support, empower, and collaborate with all juvenile courts statewide. I can talk quickly about some of the projects we're working on right now. That's the second part of this question, and I think we'll talk about those further in relation to some questions that may come up as a result of these projects that I discussed. So one, we're working right now. We supported in the legislative session in 2025 a bill called House Bill 1391. That bill was twofold. It was to help strengthen diversion in Washington State, and then also to create an ongoing diversion research project statewide to provide a report to the legislature with data collection from all 34 courts. And we're doing that in collaboration with the Administrative Office of the Courts and a researcher that they've contracted with. And we were super happy to have this bill pass because the collection of data around diversion has been an ongoing problem for WAJCA because we are a non-unified court system and every county has particular and diverse ways of handling diversion that are great in their own community, but that makes it very difficult to collect data. So we're partnering with AOC and we're super excited about how this project is unfolding. The data and the report will include how many diversions are entered into statewide and hopefully by county, the number of successfully completed diversions, the rate that those diversions are successfully completed, what offenses are referred to diversion, the number of times diversions are refused, and that would either be by the youth or by the diversion unit in the county, the number of disposition alternatives that are granted every calendar year, the number of times law enforcement referred a case to the prosecuting attorney statewide, and the number of school referrals that the prosecuting attorneys receive each year. So that's a big report and is going to contain a lot of data, and it's really helped WAJCA identify what is a diversion and how to define that was something that was sort of a cornerstone to getting this project completed, and I think we did a really good job with doing that in collaboration with all of our counties and with AOC and the researcher. We're also currently working with AOC to provide another report to the legislature, and that's regarding our early intervention programs like children in need of services, truancy and at-risk youth, We're working with DCYF and have now provided a service inventory to the legislature showing how much state funding each county receives for the fiscal year and how those funds were dispersed and sent and spent. And I guess let's talk about one more long project that we're waiting for, and that is our risk and needs assessment. Washington State was a pioneer in risk and needs assessments for juveniles. And I believe it was 97, Chris, is that? 1997 is when WAJCA decided that we needed to have a risk and needs assessment used in collaboration with our case management process with youth to lead to better outcomes. And so that is an ongoing project with AOC, and hopefully we have that completed this year and are ready to roll that out.
All right, not a short list of tasks the WAJCA is charged with or projects in development. So one takeaway I had there was, in a non-unified court system like Washington, it's obviously really difficult to make sure everyone is moving in the same direction generally. Everyone's going to be a little independent, but WAJCA's really there, was what I gathered, to make sure the ship is going in the same direction. And then also, it's hard to make any sort of changes or improvements without the data. That has been sort of proven time and time again with the courts. So I think that's really important that you're getting that data collection. And of course, the other projects, the much needed risk and needs assessment, like you mentioned. So long time coming there. That is very exciting. Chris, did you have anything to add there?
Well, I think you definitely touched on the idea of our non-unified court system and the challenge. And I think WAJCA really has risen to that challenge. We're very active on our committee side. We have 8 active committees and an executive committee. So almost every JCA is involved in one way or the other in all of the parts of the mandate that we're expected to follow through to live through our mandate. We also participate in 35 external committees ranging from OSPI, AOC, DCYF, and JR. So just a very strong effort for us to find the common ground and make sure that we are having those hard conversations sometimes about the differences and being realistic that in different size communities, it is necessary to have some of those differences as well. So I just really appreciate, as big as this job is, my peers, fellow JCAs are just such a great support and resource, and we're all in it to provide safer, healthier communities and find success for the youth that we're mandated to work with.
Yeah, I think, everyone might do it a little bit differently. Like you mentioned, King County might be a little different than something smaller like Grace Harbor County. So I think not doing the one size fits all approach, but still, acknowledging we are working towards the same goal is so important. So Chris, sticking with you here, could you maybe go over some of the major current focuses in Washington's juvenile justice system? I know it's kind of broad, but is there anything that really sticks out that people should know about?
Yeah, I think Jack touched on a lot of it, but really we're looking at, our mandate is rehabilitation, which leans towards impacting recidivism, right? And so over the last 20 years, we've learned so much about adolescent brain development, the impacts of trauma, and really have had to focus in. We already were, but I think we're really trying to use data and lean in and make sure that the best practices that we are deploying within these various programs are the best way to do things. And I think the legislature is picking up on that as well. We've had a lot of focus, like HB 1391 that Jack touched on, that had to do with our diversion reporting. We're going to be able to map the system, and then we're going to have ongoing data. And for WAJCA, there's been a high value in being able to integrate and use data in policy and really truly have some outcomes. There are times where we feel confident in the programming that we're doing because we're basing it out of the best practices and the research and the science that we've been told is most effective. But we often are not able to consistently evaluate that and have some outcome measures to kind of test against and make sure that we're proceeding correctly. We also have the focus on the early intervention work. Becca has been a big conversation legislatively over the past couple sessions, and really trying to kind of reconcile what is the court's role in that that beginning part of the continuum. We refer to it as early intervention. These are youth that often have high needs, but maybe aren't particularly high risk to delinquency yet. And the courts see high value and part of our obligation to be in that space. And the reality is there's not a lot of system partners in that space. And so some of what we're trying to understand with this report that we're working on is, again, mapping that system, measuring it against best practices, looking at our funding model to make sure it's the most effective way to spend state dollars on this work. And for WAJCA, really, it truly is just about making sure that there is effective work happening in this space, because if we get it right there, then the youth are less likely to come to the formal criminal justice system. And then last session, a lot of conversations about what we refer to as the deep end, the youth who maybe have received a lot of interventions locally and are still struggling to maintain safe behavior in their community, and trying to make sure that we have robust programming on that end. We have opportunities for that, but again, it's that consistency side and trying to kind of analyze where are the resources and which way should we be doing that in expanding disposition alternatives. WAJCA is in full support of that. And then just some of the other conversations about how challenging it can be to have these disposition alternatives in different size courts. Some counties are highly resourced and others are not. And so really trying to have a hard look at that and have a deeper understanding of how we can be most effective in that way.
Yeah, and I think we sort of touched on with all of WAJCA's charges they have, but that really, I think, highlights, how many different facets that you're trying to tackle at once. You have the mapping the diversion data, which is hugely exciting, but you also have efforts to try and, reduce recidivism, look into diversion, early intervention. It really is, all encompassing. And, it's the juvenile justice system. It's not a simple thing. We're trying to help out at-risk youth. And Jack, I'd be really interested. Do you have anything to add on to that?
Well, just kind of building off your comment right there, I think that speaking to people about the juvenile justice for the first time, or even the second time, or the fifth time, who aren't involved with it every day, it's so complex that's another one of our focuses. I think that we've really dug into the last couple of years was trying to educate our system partners who may not have the same level of knowledge on operations as we do. That's made a big difference, I think, statewide in, as Chris was saying, that when we partner with other stakeholders and explain the statutory requirements that we have, plus what we're seeing on the ground, plus what we'd like to see going forward, that education piece for everyone, including going both ways, the stakeholders educating us about what they're seeing, has really made a big difference in sort of our policy decisions and positions over the last 5 years. And I think going forward, that's another one of our major focuses, is just to educate people on what's happening on the ground. So
yeah, education is so important. You can't really make the qualified important decisions if you don't know what's happening, right? So sort of sticking with decisions, but a different kind. And Jack, we'll go with you here. How does your court decide what cases qualify for diversion? So just for a brief aside for audience, diversion being any program that redirects defendants out of the standard prosecution and into some sort of treatment, counseling, or rehabilitation. So Jack, how would you say your court decides who qualifies?
Well, I think it might be easier to just give an overview instead of just my court, because I'm a very small court. But I think in general, let me just talk about how statute sort of dictates it first, how diversions qualify, how offenses qualify for diversion. Then I can kind of talk about how that's done in different courts, if that works.
That works perfect.
Okay. So first of all, statute controls which offenses are eligible for diversion. Most first offenses that are misdemeanors or gross misdemeanors are what are called a must refer for diversion. So the prosecutor's office, or whoever your decision maker is on first juvenile offense referrals, those will be sent to the probation department, to your juvenile court staff, to be diverted. Or it could be not juvenile court staff. It could be members of the community. It could be a community board. It could be a school that handles the diversion. It could be law enforcement officers. tons of diversions, and I liked your definition of the diversion, what a diversion is, because when Chris was talking earlier about our research project with AOC around diversion, that was the first question we had to address. What is a diversion? Because there's tens of different kinds of actions that can happen after contact with law enforcement that could be considered diversion. So anyway, that happens first. The statute directs how they're qualified on the first offense. The statute also permits prosecutors and diversion units to decide what they're going to do with any subsequent referrals. So after the first referral, that statutorily is a must refer to diversion, prosecutors have a lot of discretion to decide, okay, well, maybe you're going to have a second diversion. Maybe you're going to have a third diversion. Maybe you're going to have a fourth diversion. And that's another change in the statute that happened a few years ago, where 2 diversions was the max. Now we're in an unlimited state of diversions, but prosecutors control that limit. The statute also permits prosecutors, diversion units, probation counselors to refer juveniles to other programs, community-based programs, restorative justice programs, mediation, victim offender reconciliation programs. And then the statute also asks that they're encouraged, prosecutors and juvenile courts are encouraged to engage with and partner with community-based programs to expand, improve, and increase options to divert youth from formal processing in juvenile court. So in most cases, prosecutors will make a decision on whether it goes to diversion or whether it goes to a formal court process. And then if it ends up in the juvenile court diversion process, the juvenile court will handle that diversion. Diversions that don't make it to a juvenile court run diversion program will be run by a community-based program or another partner who deals with youth and families. And then the success or non-success of that will be reported to the prosecutor's office, and they will go from there to decide how to proceed once the case is completed or once the diversion contract has been met. It's weird because it's a hard question to answer because it's so different in every county, Patrick. Like in some counties, in some counties in the state, the prosecutors control every part of this diversion outcome with an offense that comes in. Other counties, the prosecutors have delegated some of that responsibility to the probation departments and say, hey, look, if they're a first-time offender, it's a gross misdemeanor or a misdemeanor. You guys handle that as diversion. And I think there's very few of those left though, right, Chris? I would say.
I think so. And I think, like, to speak to Jack, the complexity of this question, the mandate itself, it is that the responsibility lies with the prosecuting attorney's office. The prosecuting attorney's office may decide to shave off parts of that work or large parts of that work to the local juvenile court. It is not consistent across the state how that is run. And I think our data report is going to show, and even the mapping report speaks to it, that there is a pretty high rate of inconsistent practices. You have prosecutors' offices, one big one runs their own program or has in the past. An example, for like my court in Clark County, it is solely up to the prosecuting attorney to send us those referrals, and then we can decide if we're going to keep them or not. And we often find ourselves in the position wanting more than we receive, but we don't have a lot of visibility on what is coming into the prosecutor's office. So it's a simple question if you look at the statute, but then when you kind of move over to the prosecutor's discretion, it's true for all referrals into the system that it ultimately lies with the prosecutor's office from charging this. It's basically very similar to a charging decision, just has that programmatic side tied to it as well.
And one last thing I'll say about that is the prosecutor's office does look at criminal history or history of prior diversions to help base one of the factors they use to determine whether further diversions are going to be offered, and also the offense itself. sometimes makes a difference to the prosecutor's office on whether they will offer a diversion or not, a second or third diversion. Some prosecutors won't offer a second diversion for the same sort of offense. So say you got a theft in the third degree, 6 months later you have another theft in the third degree. It's so variable from county to county on that. But the good news, if diversion is proving, and which we hope to get out of this study that's coming, to be effective with lower level offenses and with potentially more serious level offenses, but our risk and needs assessment says this youth is a kid, is someone who diversion would be beneficial, then maybe that changes minds on prosecutors and the people in the system on how many times and whether diversion is offered after an initial incomplete diversion or a failed diversion. It'll be very interesting to see how that data looks.
I think the areas for opportunity are to really analyze the developmentally appropriate response, and diversion is an area that has a lot of opportunity for that. I think the old perspective of punishment it doesn't match for what we know about the research for adolescent brain development, and so that's where I think we get most excited. WAJCA, many of us, I think I can speak for us, saying that we want more diversions, we want more opportunity to be in this space. It is important to us to intervene at the earliest possible moment, and diversion provides that opportunity within our system. There's also community-based deflection opportunities that could be invested in that don't exist in many communities. So that to me is where I think, speaking to Jack about, as people become educated in how to think about diversion and how it aligns and how can we make it align with adolescent brain development and the research that we know about the effectiveness of dosage, assessing needs and risk level. It shouldn't be based on the crime type in itself. And currently that is the model.
Another great thing about the WAJCA organization is that, especially around diversion is much more fluid than the formal court process. As an organization, as a learning organization, we learn a lot from other courts in relation to what they're doing in diversion. A small court may have a great idea that they're doing with diversion youth that a large court may say, well, let's take a look at that. A large court may be performing some sort of diversion activity with youth, and a small court says, I would have never known about this if we hadn't been in association. And that sharing information on us learning from each other is a real strength of the organization.
Yeah, I think a lot of times on this podcast, especially, we've talked about the non-unified court system and how many challenges that raises. But you also got to look at some of the benefits. All of these courts doing things a little bit differently from each other gives the opportunity for more learning and experimenting from each other. So that's great. And I do think the depth of that answer you both gave, which I really appreciate, shows that how much of a tough question it is. It's the constant balancing act of, I think the goal of everyone in juvenile courts would be to help these youth as much as possible, live a productive life and be rehabilitated. But you also have that responsibility to make sure the community is safe. So if diversion can help do that while helping the youth, that's obviously the goal. And I think it's great that more research and funding and efforts going in to hopefully get some data on this and keep doing it further. So, Jack, sticking with you here, we talked about diversion, but I want to talk a little bit more about what that looks like in practice. What are some of the detention alternative programs that your courts are currently employing, or courts that you know of around the state are currently employing? What do those look like?
So we'll start with probably the biggest one, and that is JDAI, which is Juvenile Detention Alternatives Initiative. That started in 2004. As of last year, there's 7 courts that are still part of the project. The interesting thing about those 7 is they comprise 61% of Washington's youth between 10 and 17 years old. And basically, in a nutshell, what the Detention Alternatives Initiative is providing strategies to the courts to reduce the use of secure detention. And those they're numerous. We're not going to go into a big, long list on that, but that is probably the main, what you would say is statewide detention alternative program. is JDAI?
I think I just touched on what you were just trying to say there, and it's that probation practices have really moved away from the old way of surveillance and compliance. Our probation counselors are now trained to focus on motivating behavior change, addressing barriers. We use a risk assessment to match targeted interventions that are intended to reduce recidivism, but there's a lot of skill building and behavior change interventions that are deployed by our probation counselors in the work that they do using goal setting and incentivizing in order to motivate that behavior change. So I think while JDAI is an example of a formal structural model that does have data and outcome measures that can be used, particularly to look at racial and ethnic disparity within our system at arrest, but also adding that side of how we are deploying our case management within our probation has shifted significantly and has resulted in less probation violations coming before the court, which always put a youth at risk for a use of detention outcome. We really are, when I started in 1997, the training was follow the court order. If the youth isn't following it, tell the court. And there weren't a lot of tools or options. And we have really built out that toolkit and grounded it in research and best practice.
Yeah, I'm glad you said that, Chris. That's a good point. That it's a blend, right? I mean, especially if you're talking about someone, a youth who's looking at a pretty substantial sentence, that there's a lot of discretion left to the JPCs, the juvenile probation counselors. But that discretion is grounded, as Chris says, in evidence-based and best practices that we live by every day. So I'm glad you had that to say at the end of it.
You got me there.
And just one more thing, Patrick, there's so many other things that have led to detention alternative. I mean, not that aren't programs. I mean, I guess that's probably the toughest part of that question is it's good to look at we talk about the programs that exist. But as Chris said, there's so many philosophical changes that have happened in the last, I would say 10 to 15 years,
Yeah.
exponential changes that I probably should have pulled that. I mean, that's information that would be good to have is the reduction in detention days statewide from 2016 to 2026. And a lot of it is due to, one, increase in diversion, number two, a philosophical and substantial change in the practices from the juvenile courts. Do you agree on that, Chris?
Yeah, I think that's where my urge to kind of reframe the question, because I think there needs to be an understanding that use of detention in itself does not necessarily mean you have to have a detention alternative. I think it really is understanding truly what the purpose and intent of detention is. It's an expensive resource that has significant impacts on a youth's outcomes. And so it should be used cautiously and really only for situations where the community risk is such that it needs to happen. Otherwise, there are a world and wealth of possibilities that we have created within our systems to respond. And we really are trying to reframe that thinking from using detention to just response. What is the appropriate response? And then that's where you're delving into that toolkit. And, again, JDAI does provide some structures. There's detention risk assessments that are used to control admission and who comes in and who comes out. And then policies that come out of that. There can be different kinds of warrants and informal alternatives as well before you even have to get to the courtroom.
Yeah, and one of the things I really liked most that you discussed there was the philosophical shift that's happened the past 10, 15 years. I think a lot of people kind of view the courts and legal system as kind of slow moving and plodding when it comes to development, whether that's accurate or inaccurate. But I think just seeing that juvenile courts are one of the place that I feel like needs that constant evolution. It needs that almost like taking both the anecdotal experience approach, the qualitative and quantitative approach to it, right? And also, I love that you saying that recidivism is not the be all end all. Is after these rehabilitation program, the diversion, whatever system they go through, is it doesn't just stop. It's like, all right, you go out and do whatever. Is there is still some effort and care put into these youth. So I think you both have done a fantastic job of just teaching us a lot about the juvenile justice system today. So I want to thank you both for coming on and give you each a chance. Is there anything you'd like to leave us off on?
I think it's important for folks to know that we recognize that accountability and community safety are best achieved when we address harm in ways that repair relationships rather than deepen cycles of punishment. This whole conversation has really been focused on, recidivism and outcomes. And I think there's that humanizing element too, of creating healthy communities and how do we invest in our youth and support them. And I believe that that is a huge value for the juvenile court administrators across the state.
Jack, anything to add?
After that, no.
Fair enough. That's a great way to end it on. And I hope for our audience, I know it did for me, this helped put some faith in you that the juvenile justice system in Washington wants what's best for communities and wants what's best for our youth. So Chris, Jack, thank you both for coming on the show so much, and you have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, Patrick.
Thank you, Patrick.